Hello and welcome to another video with me, Mike Hutchinson. I'm the designer of Gaslands and other tabletop games, and Glenn Ford, the lead designer on Gaslands and the designer of a number of other fine tabletop experiences. In the next of these short video chats between Glenn and me in our well-stocked hobby dungeons, I'm going to ask Glenn some questions about his fantastic deck unbuilder, Moonflight, which kickstarted successfully in October last year. Glenn, hello. What's a deck unbuilder?
It's a deck builder that you then unbuild. Obviously, deck builders are a fairly well-known tabletop genre at this point. For anybody who doesn't know what a deck builder is, they're a series of games. Probably the earliest and most famous is Dominion, about to be pulled off a shelf.
This is a deck builder.
Yes, Dominion being the sort of the originator, the granddaddy of it, the Spiel des Jahres winner. Basically, it takes the part at the start of a game of Magic the Gathering or something similar, where instead of deck building being the thing that you do before you play, it's the whole game. So in a standard deck builder, you get some cards, you use the cards to buy better cards, you use the better cards to buy better cards, and so on. And then at the end of the game, generally, you've then got a deck of cards that you score, and that decides who wins or loses the game. It's a whole genre, and I think it's a beautiful, elegant games design concept. The way that the thing that drives the game is in itself the thing that scores the game. Dominion's a beautiful, elegant game where scoring cards don't do anything in your deck. So the more that you score, the more you're clogging up your deck, which has this sort of beautiful inbuilt sort of headwind element where the winner starts getting dragged back by their own score. But the point is, often at the end of these games, you then have two situations. Firstly, you end up with a deck that just as it's clicking, just as it's doing all the cool things you've built it to do and designed it for, the game goes game over now, and often you're like, but my deck was just doing cool things. I want to watch it do its cool things. And the second thing is that because the deck ends up holding your points, you then have one of the more anticlimactic scoring rounds in gaming, where you go through a deck of like 30 cards. And Dominion's cards are nice and big and chunky, but other deck builders have scores written at the bottom of the card in little print, and you end up sort of counting through 20 cards and then having to multiply some of them out, and then you have to recount it because you lost by that 1 point. And I had this idea of what would it be like if at the end of the game, instead of scoring your deck for whatever reason, you scored the hand of cards that you had at the end of the game. Whatever you happened to be holding when the game end triggered was your score. And so there have been deck deconstruction games before where you get given a deck and you have to filter it out more quickly than the other person. What Moonflight does is you start as a sort of traditional deck builder. You've got a hand of 10 cards. You have to build from your marketplace to a scoring deck. Then once the marketplace empties, all the cards literally physically spin 180 degrees, and they go from having normal traditional deck building powers to having deck trashing and filtering powers. And the game ends, instead of it ending when the marketplace empties, it ends when one player doesn't have a deck left, when they've got their whole deck in their hand, and then you both score whatever's in your hand. So it's that second half of the game that justifies that deck unbuilder process. You've put the deck together, you've built an engine, you've now got to start pulling cogs out while the engine is still running, and hope that you don't wrench something out that's vital for the engine that you've built, and hopefully time it just right, unbuild it just elegantly enough that you end up with exactly 5 scoring cards, bang, as the game ends. That's the theory of Moonflight, certainly.
Yeah, it's a nice visual image as you describe of like you blow the wheels off your car as it's slowing down and it just you knock off the front wheels just as it skids gently into your parking space.
I always love there's a Studio Ghibli film, Howl's Moving Castle, and there's a bit in Howl's Moving Castle where they pull the fire that runs the castle out of its fireplace, and the castle starts to fall to pieces as it's moving along, and there are fewer and fewer and fewer and fewer bits as it's chunking along, and then it just ends up with just a few sort of floorboards that they're all stood on, and I picture that as being, if I could make a visual metaphor for Moonflight, that's what I would like it to be. That sort of weird steampunk falling to piece engine. Yeah.
And this was your second Kickstarted game. Did you take this one to Kickstarter as your second game because it was the next, was it like the next game that just kind of came out of you, or did you have a bunch of things and you kind of tried a few things and threw them away? Like, did you know this was going to be your second project, or did it announce itself to you?
I mean, I always have. These are prototype games sitting on the shelf. There's
Ooh.
a whole bunch of stuff sitting behind. These are all prototyped games in a box. And then there's as with all, I think, games designers, I've got a clipboard file with a page of sort of 100 ideas, and then all the slightly more developed bits of those ideas and the mechanics that don't currently fit into a game.
I suspect being this Glenn that we're talking about, he's probably talking about an actual clipboard, not a file on his computer.
Yeah, no. It's an actual, crocodile clip file. So there's always 101 ideas. One thing though is that I think that despite the fact that when you're designing for Kickstarter, you're self-publishing and you're designing for yourself, you have a brief for Kickstarter. Whoops. You have a brief for Kickstarter. It might not be a brief handed to you by a publisher or somebody else. You still have to sort of give yourself the best possible chance by fitting to a set of rules, as it were. And so it's always, for me, about figuring out which of the game ideas I have, fit the brief of being something that will work on Kickstarter, B, hopefully being something that pushes my finding out how to produce games and how to market games to the next step. Because it feels like I've spent the last 30, 40 years learning to design games, and about a year or 2 years learning to produce and market games. So again, Moonflight was the next step up from SSO in size and complexity of the product. But also it ticked a lot of boxes for something that was going to work well on Kickstarter. It's an interesting twist on a very popular genre. The deck, as soon as you say to gamers, it's a deck unbuilder, people go, okay, I'm going to give you 5 minutes to explain to me what you mean by that. And just having a one-line tagline on Kickstarter, which gets a gamer to go, I'll give you 5 minutes on that. That's the reason Moonflight had to be the next game, because it had that to it. It had that element. It was an idea that I was kicking around for a while, and then a few things clicked to make it actually work. So I wanted to do the deck unbuilder idea for a while, the deck deconstruction part, but I didn't want to just hand people a deck and go, there you go, work from there. And figuring out the way the turn works and the way the turn triggers, and that the game had these two stages to it, was the thing that sort of clicked into place. And and that informed a lot of the imagery of the game, the sort of the world that was that was built around it. And that also meant that it gave me a very clear vision for the imagery of the game, which was another thing that I learned after SSO. It helps to have some good, strong, striking images for Kickstarter. And so, I mean, all those things came together for Moonflight, and it just felt like, okay, this obviously has to be the next game. All these things are right there. All the things are right for what I want it to be, what I want to do with it, how I want it to help me to market it.
Cool. So, Glenn, what's in the box and why?
Okay. So in Moonflight, there are 4 Jacks who are the sort of the strange fairy-like creatures who rule the world of Moonflight. Moonflight is a sort of eternal fairy world that comes into being as the moon rises and fades out of existence again as it falls. And it's strange, jaded rulers play this game of cards to decide who's going to rule the town of Moonflight for the next however many eternities. So in the box, there are 4 separate decks, one for each of the Jacks, the Jack of Clay of Bones, the Jack of Words and Names, the Jack of Cotton Hovel, and the Jack of Bond and Kind. Each of them comes with a deck of cards that they bring to the marketplace. Anybody can buy anybody else's cards, but you bring your own deck, and they work particularly well with your own asymmetrical Jack. There's a set of neutral marketplace cards. There's also a set of AI cards. So there's 2 ways you can play Moonflight solo. You can use a set of AI cards that will literally play like list players for you, or there's a sort of score attack mode that counts through the turns through the first half of the game and then the second half of the game to sort of keep it timed and challenged. Other than that, there's a chunky metal coin that we got as a Kickstarter stretch goal. Yeah, that's pretty much what there is in a box of Moonflight, certainly.
And so why have the factions? I think lots of people will be familiar with deck builders that are like Dominion, quite neutral. It's you are all starting from the same buffet, and then it's what you do with the options in front of you. Why did you choose a faction system for this game?
I mean, firstly, I think because I'd like to be able to do an expansion for Moonflight. There's a couple of things I want to put in there, but I don't know that I'll be able to do many expansions for it. I don't know that I'll be able to put out an enormous amount of content for it. And I wanted to offer as many different ways of playing the game for gamers as I possibly could in one go. And so each of the Jacks hits a particular sort of play style or mechanical element that the particular player might enjoy. So, for example, the Jack of Clay and Bones is Moonflight's sort of gravedigger. He's the discard pile manipulator. He's the massed trasher, and the guy who can dig back through discarded and trashed cards, which is something that deck builder fans quite enjoy. Words and Names is the hand manipulator. He has an increased hand size, and his game ends up being about managing to edit your hand management, get the right cards and the right number of cards in your hand at the right time. Cotton Hovel is the tableau builder, and Bond and Kind is the sort of the griefer deck. He has the ability to mess with the other players because he's the banker. He can drop debts and loans onto other people. And I think because basically if I put all of those in cards in sufficient quantity to allow all 4 players to all have access to enough cards to build a working Bond and Kind deck over a game that would run for long enough, the game would have ended up costing sort of 40-50 quid. By saying, okay, you're all allowed to share each other's marketplace, but you bring an asymmetric deck of cards and asymmetric abilities, I was able to give players who want to play that deck or this deck or that style the ability to do it within a box that was £20 instead of double or triple that price. So the asymmetry basically allowed me to get more mileage out of fewer cards and keep the price down. I suppose was the ultimate motivator for doing that. Also, I had a bunch of ideas for looks and imagery hanging around, and I wanted to do these different themes and play with these different images.
Let's talk about the illustrations then. I think you've said it already here. You won't mind me saying it's visually a more striking game than SSO. So tell me about the artwork. How did it come about, and what did you learn through that process?
I think that the first lesson from SSO was, if you're going to kickstart a game, get some artwork that has figures in it, living beings, rather than just places and locations and scenes and such like. SSO is a very bleak world. The crew die, and for that reason, none of the crew have images of them, because I don't want you to get too attached to them. Horrible things going to happen to this guy. I don't want you thinking of his family and children when it's gonna go on. You'll get plenty attached to them, even as little blank meeples. I don't want to make you cry. With Moonflight, because you are the Jacks and you're going to be a single Jack, we can have these figures, and it's also so because Moonflight is meant to be this sort of eternal fairy world, it gave me the opportunity to I'm a bit of a sort of information magpie, and it gave me opportunity to dig into artistic references and historical references. So for example, the figure of Words and Names, he, in the story of Moonflight, he's a sort of parasitic entity that goes from person to person. He's the story and the history of Moonflight, and that history sort of possesses an individual and gives them great power for a short time, but eventually sort of mummifies and consumes them. And within that, I chose to reference a thing that you see in old Anglo-Saxon churches, a thing called the acanthus leaf pattern, where you have these prototype sort of green men who, instead of having the sort of the power of the forest, they have these vines coming out of their mouths as a sort of a punishment for some sort of sin of some kind. And those vines come out and they wrap back around them and sort of strangle them and torment them. And that's the reference for Words and Names. He's this sort of acanthus leaf figure who is at the top of the card, the scrolls that are the acanthus leaf are coming out, and they're wrapping round and consuming the figure at the bottom of the card. And each of them have a whole sort of range of references. So Clay and Bones' card references Celtic knotwork patterns and medieval sort of tarot decks that had lessons about gluttony and greed built into them. Again, Bond and Kind has a very strong Celtic Nordic patterning built into it, and Cotton Hovel has a sort of as a reference to a sort of Bruegel paintings of the beekeepers, for he contains within him the elements of the farmer and the beekeeper and the mason, the three parts of the traditional village life. And so, yeah, for me, it was a chance to lay in a lot of mythology and a lot of history into those images. There's a lot of depth there. As you see in a lot of these very beautiful medieval decks of cards, they have these images that have layers and elements of meaning and things you can dig into and examine. And I wanted to give a certain amount of that with the Moonflight cards. And the payback is you then get a big image of a guy in a plague mask that you can then put on Facebook, and people can go, he looks cool, I want to know what game he's attached to. You get to attract people, you know, there are people who are going to turn up because you've got a dark fairy world that you've built, and it's lovely that it's got an interesting game attached, but they're going to turn up for the weird jacks and the weird imagery. And it's when you are doing something independent, and you've got to pick your fights for what you pay for and what artwork you get, and you need to try and get as much work out of every image and every element that you possibly can. And just learning that, yeah, having a big cool looking being to sell Moonflight, yeah, that was an important lesson to learn from SSO, where it's just a sort of bleak, echoing, heartless, cold vacuum of a ship that, yeah, for some reason doesn't turn people on, particularly when you show them those images.
And the front cover itself, you drew that one, right?
Yes, yeah, that was me. I designed that myself.
It's really awesome.
Generally,
Why did you do the front cover and not any of the other art, or was it on a whim? Or
the main reason I didn't do the other art is I can't draw.
You can. It's clear. It's demonstrated here.
I mean, the thing about the front cover was that I wanted a very, very specific set of references from Art Nouveau, and so one of the things about the beings of Moonflight is that they're eternal and they're ancient, but they've not only been around in ancient times, they've been here inspiring and returning to us throughout history. And so I wanted to have a very strong Art Nouveau. I know it's not super sort of modern, but it's a relatively modern but classical reference, and have within it also that idea of nature, of eternity. And so I had a very, very clear idea of what I wanted from it. I took a lot of references from books of monograms, actually, of Art Nouveau monograms. Took a lot of references from those and very carefully and painstakingly worked it through. And it's it's one of those things where I had such a clear image of what it had to be, and by very slowly and carefully sort of scratching it out, I was able to put it together. And at that point there was no point giving it to an artist, because it was what it had to be anyway. Whereas for the cards, for example, there's a sketch somewhere. I think it's still on the website. I don't have the original sketch. It's gone off to a backer now. But there's a sketch of this sort of bone figure and this other figure sort of wrapped around each other in sort of pencil outlines. And that's what I first showed to Henry, the artist, to do Clay and Bones. And it's like, it would take an eternity to get close to those images on all of those cards. And while I've got a clear idea of the art direction and what I want from him, I can't turn that artwork out at anything like the rate that's necessary, and I don't think I could get it to the level that he'd been able to turn in anyway, however much time I had.
Cool. So you mentioned the possibility that there was still a bit of design space that you wanted to explore. Have you any plans for Moonflight? Will it be something that you might include as part of a future Manor Kent Kickstarter, or no plans?
I'd really like to go back to Moonflight. There's a new Jack that I would definitely like to do. So one of the things about the Jacks is that each of them, you can start with whoever Jack you like, but there are a suggested order sort of in the rule book, because the first two, Clay and Bones and Words and Names, play a fairly understandable traditional deck builder game. And so you just have to handle this weirdness when halfway through the game all your cards transform what they do. And then the other two decks introduce some slightly more unique to Moonflight concepts. They start fiddling with the way that Moonflight manipulates its marketplace, and they start fiddling with the way that Moonflight builds its tableau, which is fine if no one's messing with it, but if someone's messing with it, it's kind of hard to learn it whilst it's being messed with. And what I would like to do is a deck that messes with the turn itself. So the turn is the bit in the game where all the cards pivot through 180 degrees. And I've got ideas for a deck that messes with that mechanic, but putting a deck in that messed with that mechanic in the game where that mechanic was the whole thing that was messing with your head in the first place was just a bit too much to punish players with in the initial game.
So is this a Jack that allows the turn to flip-flop?
So it'd be the Jack of Delirium, who can turn and return and unturn and turn cards early and turn cards back throughout the game for themselves and other players. It wouldn't flip the whole turn because that would be too big, but it can just tweak one card and spin one ability at an interesting point in the game. So that would be the Jack of Delirium. There was another deck that was about giving cards as gifts to people, and stealing cards off of people, which ended up being Bond and Kind, and I never quite got to work. But I'd like to go back to the idea of a deck in Moonflight that actually gives you cards that aren't awful, that actually has a sort of a more interactive giving and taking. But anyway, the big thing that I'd like to do in an expansion is to offer the ability to put different cards into your starting marketplace deck. So each Jack comes with a marketplace of cards which have very specific values in order to balance the different decks. So each deck has the same number of points scorable before the turn and the same number of points scorable after the turn, and it has the same number of unique cards in it. And that's in there just so that the decks are all balanced. But it does mean that if I put an expansion that says, okay, and the rules are there in the core rule book that says, okay, you're only allowed X many points in your overall deck before the turn. You're only allowed X many points after the turn. You're only allowed 8 unique cards. I could give you a whole new deck of other cards and let you build your own marketplace. You could, and at that point, you'd be able to deck build before you unbuild, which is is too pleasing to not try and jam into an expansion. So that would be the main thing that the expansion would do. It would let you deck build your marketplace before the game. But again, that's too much to dump on a player when they first pick up the game. You don't want to sort of get like, oh, here's 60 cards, now take 24 to be your initial marketplace deck. But maybe after you've played Moonflight for a year or two and someone comes back to you and says, okay, here's another 30 cards, you can build your own marketplace. That's hopefully a little bit more exciting to people.
That sounds really cool. Well, it's a fascinating game, and I recommend people check it out. It's available. You can click through from Kickstarter if you search from Moonflight for Moonflight, but there's you can also check it out on your website, presumably.
Yep. www.manokentgames.com. It's got a whole little subsection of pages, and we've certainly got a shop that you can click through to and buy it on there. So
lovely. Glenn, nice to chat.
Lovely as always, Mike, and hopefully we'll speak again soon.
All right, see you for the next installment. Bye.
Bye.